Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Good morning, I'm Nathan Hager.
And I'm Karen Moscow. Here are the stories we're following today.
Karen, we begin with politics. President-elect Donald Trump continues moving quickly to fill in key positions for his second term. Bloomberg News has learned Trump will appoint Marco Rubio as Secretary of State and Florida Representative Mike Waltz as National Security Advisor. Both men have track records of harshly criticizing China. We get more from Bloomberg senior editor Bill Ferries.
Mike Waltz, he's a congressman from Florida, former Green Beret and veteran of the Afghan War. Definitely a hawk on things like China and U.S. military policy in places like the Middle East. Then you have Marco Rubio, is well known on foreign policy circles for his focus on Latin America, places like Venezuela and Cuba, partly because he's from Miami. But he is very much a hawk on China as well.
Bloomberg's Bill Ferry says Trump's picks give some indication of the direction his next term will take after the Republican campaigned on threats to impose a 60% blanket tariff on Chinese products. Stocks in China dropped 1%. Hong Kong's Hang Seng slipped almost 3% following that news of Trump's appointments.
Well, Nathan, the president-elect is also tapping a loyalist to fill out his team focused on securing the border and carrying out a mass deportation. CNN is reporting Trump will name South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem to lead the Department of Homeland Security. Noem will join Trump's border czar, Tom Homan, and immigration hardliner Stephen Miller when he takes office in January. Unlike those positions, Noem would need Senate confirmation to take over Homeland Security.
Well, one person who won't be joining Trump for a second term, Karen, is one of his sons. Bloomberg News has learned Donald Trump Jr. is joining 1789 Capital. That's a venture capital firm that invests in conservative-leaning companies. The younger Trump has played an active role in his father's latest presidential campaign and White House transition.
Well, Nathan, Trump has picked several loyalists from Capitol Hill to fill out his cabinet. That threatens to cut into Republicans' razor-thin majority in the House. But the GOP is still on track to hold on to Congress once all the votes are counted. As of now, the Associated Press has called 214 House races for Republicans and 205 for Democrats. It takes 218 to win. Bloomberg's Derek Wallbank is watching the races closely.
On the House side, you are looking at a paper-thin majority, no matter how much it shapes up. It looks at this point like Republicans are going to hold the House. My guess right now, if I were counting it up, would be somewhere around 222 seats. The majority is at 218. So that's not too much of a distance.
And Bloomberg's Derek Wallbank, a 215 seat, is close to joining the GOP column in Colorado. Freshman Democrat Yadira Caraveo conceded that race on Sunday, and Republicans will win a 216th seat in Washington, where GOP candidates are running against each other. That would leave 14 races still undecided.
Meantime, Karen, the last race that was left to be called in the Senate is complete. Democrat Ruben Gallego defeated Republican Carrie Lake for an open seat in Arizona. That puts the final Senate count at 53 Republicans and 47 Democrats.
Well, Nathan, Bitcoin's record-breaking rally since Trump was reelected is in full swing. The digital asset has surged past $89,000. Mike McGlone covers commodities for Bloomberg Intelligence.
The world changed last Tuesday, and it's almost a perfect storm for Bitcoin. So think of all the anti-Bitcoin regulation and pushback from the previous administration and Gary Gensler. That's completely flipped.
Bloomberg Intelligence's Mike McGlone says Bitcoin has jumped about 32% since the election a week ago. And checking Bitcoin right now, it is at $87,400.
And we're continuing to watch Tesla shares as well, Karen. After they climbed 9% yesterday in the pre-market, they're now down about 5.5%. Tesla's rallied more than 40% over the past 5 sessions. And Wedbush analyst Dan Ives has raised his price target on the EV maker from $300 to $400. The stock is trading near $330 this morning.
Well, as for the overall markets here, Nathan, futures are lower after another winning day on Wall Street. However, we did see a stock rotation. Most big tech stocks fell, while small cap stock rallied. Matt Michigan, co-chief investment strategist at John Hancock Investment Management, says the markets are pretty richly valued.
The fundamentals are okay. Don't get me wrong. I mean, earnings are up about 5-6% here in Q3, and the economy is holding in pretty well. But this repricing to us is getting rich, and the PE ratio on the S&P 500 pushing up on 22 times, 27 times on a trailing basis is really looking at kind of tech bubble type valuations, and it's going to be hard for fundamentals to come in and deliver given how much good news is really priced into these markets.
John Hancock Investment Management's Matt Mishkin noted the S&P 500 is up almost 4% since the election.
And earnings continue this morning, Karen. Home Depot is set to report before the opening bell. We get a preview from Bloomberg's Tom Busby.
Same-store sales at Home Depot expected to continue to dip a little lower, a reflection of the uneven U.S. housing market and rising prices. Investors, of course, want to know what the chain's outlook is on housing and whether hurricane-related demand could boost sales. Also of interest, any shifts in consumer spending and the impact of potential tariffs from the incoming Trump administration. Bloomberg consensus calls for comp sales to be down 3.27%. Revenues forecast to be $39.29 billion. Adjusted earnings per share of $3.66. Tom Busby, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Tom, thanks. Well, in Asia, shares of Nissan surged almost 13%. The rally comes after an activist investor took a 2.5% stake in the embattled Japanese automaker. The jump in shares comes after Nissan plunged last week after the car maker announced plans to slash jobs and cut production capacity and lowered its operating income forecast by 70%. Time now for a look at some of the other stories making news in New York and around the world. And for that, we're joined by Bloomberg's John Tucker. John, good morning.
And good morning, Karen. President-elect Donald Trump has selected former New York Congressman Lee Zeldin to lead the Environmental Protection Agency. The story this morning in this report from Bloomberg's Charlie Pellet.
It places the Long Island Republican in charge of the president's plans to boost energy production and curb regulations. In a social media post, Zeldin said he would work to, quote, restore U.S. energy dominance, revitalize our auto industry to bring back American jobs, and make the U.S. the global leader of AI. Zeldin's portfolio is expected to include ending the Biden administration's pause on constructing new natural gas export terminals and redrawing national monument boundaries to permit mining and development. In New York, Charlie Pellet, Bloomberg Radio.
President Joe Biden's administration is setting out plans for the U.S. to triple nuclear power capacity by 2050. Under a roadmap being unveiled today, the U.S. would deploy an additional 200 gigawatts of nuclear energy capacity by mid-century through the construction of new reactors, plant restarts, and upgrades to existing facilities. The strategy is one that could win continued support under President-elect Donald Trump, who called for new nuclear reactors on the campaign trail. World leaders are converging today at the UN Annual Climate Conference in Azerbaijan. Although the big names and powerful countries are noticeably absent, the top leaders of the 13 largest carbon dioxide polluting countries will not appear. Still, there is progress. Climate negotiators are near creating the first ever global carbon market. And Palestinian medical officials say 2 Israeli strikes in Gaza killed at least 14 people, including 2 children and a woman. The deaths came as 8 international aid groups said in a report today that Israel has failed to meet U.S. demands that allow greater humanitarian access to the Gaza Strip. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm John Tucker, and this is Bloomberg. Karen and Nathan.
All right, John, thank you. Time now for the Bloomberg Sports Update, brought to you by Tri-State Audi. Here's Dan Schwartzman. Dan, good morning.
Good morning, Karen. Week 10 of the NFL season coming to an end. The Dolphins snapping a 3-game losing streak, a 23-15 win on the road over the Los Angeles Rams.
Protection breaks down. Tagovailoa looking for somewhere. Wide open is Waddle. And a big play on 3rd and 13.
That's courtesy of ABC. Tua Tagovailoa completing 20 of 28 passes for just over 200 yards with a touchdown and an interceptions. Dolphins improved to 3-6 on the season. Rams falling to 4-5. Baseball announcing its awards finalists with no surprises. Dodgers star Shohei Ohtani and Yankee slugger Aaron Judge leading the MVP picks in their respective leagues. Ohtani joined in the National League by Francisco Lindor of the Mets and Ketel Marte of the Diamondbacks. On the American League, Yankees star Juan Soto and Bobby Witt Jr. of the Kansas City Royals are finalists alongside Judge. Chris Sale, Zach Wheeler, and Pirates rookie Paul Skeens are NL Cy Young Award finalists, while in the AL, Tarek Skubal, Seth Lugo, and Emmanuel Clase are the finalists. In the NBA, the Cleveland Cavaliers are just the 8th team to start a season 12-0 after knocking off the Bulls 119-113 behind 36 points from Donovan Mitchell. Elsewhere, the Thunder are now 9-2. OKC knocking off the Clippers 134-128. Nets slipping past the Pelicans 107-105, while the Wizards lose at the Rockets 107-92. Knicks in action tonight on the road versus the 76ers. Celtics are hosting the Hawks. A battle of juggernauts tonight in the NHL. Rangers are hosting the 14-1 Winnipeg Jets. Meanwhile, Bruins are at the Blues. Devils visiting the Panthers, while the Edmonton Oilers are hosting the Islanders. That's your Bloomberg Sports Update. I'm Dan Schwartzman, Karen and Nathan.
Coast to coast on Bloomberg Radio, nationwide on Sirius XM, and around the world on Bloomberg.com and the Bloomberg Business app. This is Bloomberg Daybreak.
Good morning. I'm Nathan Hager. President-elect Donald Trump may be signaling a much tougher approach to foreign policy with his latest cabinet picks. He is set to name Florida Senator Marco Rubio Secretary of State. Rubio has made no secret about what he considers the greatest threat to the U.S.
China today is the single most formidable adversary the United States has ever faced. The Soviet Union was not an industrial power, a technological power, a commercial power.
That was Senator Rubio speaking on Capitol Hill nearly 2 years ago. This morning, we're joined by Bloomberg's Kevin Whitelaw. Kevin, good morning. China hawkishness was a hallmark of the first Trump administration. Is it going to be and then some this time around? Good morning.
Yeah, good morning. I do think that we all expected that he was going to come in to his second term and be very, very aggressive when it comes to China, particularly on trade. And I think that you're starting to see that's playing out in his picks. Obviously, the Marco Rubio pick doesn't seem entirely final, but it is what we're expecting at this point. And that's a hallmark of where Rubio's been. Interestingly, Rubio's actually someone who's been a Ukraine supporter as well. So that made it a little outside the box from that perspective, given where Trump's rhetoric has been on Ukraine. I think for the China side and also now, if you look at some of the other picks for the immediate names, Israel, I think, also would have to be feeling very good about the voices that they're seeing coming into to shape for the cabinet as well.
A lot of Wall Street listeners are waiting to hear what former president, now President-elect Trump, is thinking in terms of tariffs. He's campaigned on 60% across the board tariffs on China. Does Rubio's appointment signal anything there?
Ultimately, Secretary of State isn't normally the main sort of voice on that. So I think I want to wait and sort of see where we're going to get sort of Treasury Secretary, U.S. Trade Rep, some of the, Commerce, some of the other sort of more economic things. But obviously, Secretary of State's a voice there. Rubio's not someone who's sort of been hardcore on tariffs, but I do think that he'll be part. He'll understand that he has to go along with what the broad push for the White House is on this. I think when it comes to where we're expecting that to go, be a little careful about what any specific numbers are. I think the idea here is to take Trump seriously and not literally. We'll have to see where he ends up, and the starting point may be more of a negotiating position than necessarily the end point. So he's going to want to make a splash early on, but that as to what kind of a splash and where that actually ends up landing, we'll have to see how it settles out.
Rubio's appointment is another pick out of Capitol Hill. He's named Congresswoman Elise Stefanik as UN ambassador, Florida Congressman Mike Waltz as national security advisor. Does that signal confidence from the president-elect that Republicans are going to hold on to their majorities and that he's going to win quick confirmation for some of these picks?
I mean, I do think it's interesting. I think in some ways the picks are probably a little more traditional. Isn't maybe exactly what I think, but they're not perhaps as sort of far out of the mainstream as some Democrats and critics may have feared he would go. So at least from an early start, this does at least signal these are folks who have won elections and are part of a little more in the mainstream parties. So there's probably a little bit of relief even within the Republican Party about some of these early choices, but it does raise some challenging questions potentially for that control control of the House, particularly if it's really, really slim. He's obviously picking people who are in reasonably safe districts, but there may be some hiccups along the way, depending on where the actual sort of line ends up with in control of the House. It is looking like Republicans will probably hold on, but that margin could be uncomfortably slim, particularly if he's going to pick off a few people for his cabinet.
In our last minute, Kevin, one choice he's not making from Capitol Hill is South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem for Homeland Security, adding to his border security team.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, she'll come in the position of having to be part of the sort of deportation pledge that Trump has made for undocumented immigrants, obviously. South Dakota isn't normally what you think of as a border state, so her level of experience on some of these issues is not exactly what you might have assumed. But she's been a tough talker on these issues. She's had a strong stance on it, and I think that she did move to back Trump very early on.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak, your morning podcast on the stories making news from Wall Street to Washington and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed by 6 a.m. Eastern each morning on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen.
You can also listen live each morning starting at 5 a.m. Wall Street time on Bloomberg 1130 in New York, Bloomberg 99.1 in Washington, Bloomberg 92.9 in Boston, and nationwide on Sirius XM Channel 121.
Plus, listen coast to coast on the Bloomberg Business app, now with Apple CarPlay and Android Auto interfaces.
And don't forget to subscribe to Bloomberg News Now. It's the latest news whenever you want it, in 5 minutes or less. Search Bloomberg News Now on your favorite podcast platform to stay informed all day long. I'm Karen Moscow.
And I'm Nathan Hager. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day right here on Bloomberg Daybreak.